King Arthur may have been a real man, and this broken stone on the coast of Croatia may be all that is left of him. The Latin carved into it records a forgotten Roman officer, Lucius Artorius Castus, his rank, his wars, his post at the far edge of the empire. Some historians believe he is the man behind the legend, that the most famous king in British history was never a king at all. He was a soldier who died forgotten, and almost no one has ever read his name. To understand how a soldier becomes King Arthur, you have to start with the emperor who created him by accident. A man who spent his whole life convinced that legends were impossible. In the year 175, the Emperor Marcus Aurelius sat in a military camp on the Danube frontier, writing in a private journal he never meant anyone to read. He was writing about how nothing lasts, that the remembered man and the forgotten man end in exactly the same place, that within a few short generations, even the greatest names, Alexander, Caesar, would dwindle into almost nothing. Dust, talking about dust. Then he closed the journal and made a decision that took him perhaps 10 minutes. He had just spent years grinding down a confederation of horse tribes on the river, and as a term of their surrender, he demanded soldiers. 5,500 of their finest cavalry, conscripted into the Roman army and marched to the single most distant posting the empire owned, the cold, wind-scoured frontier of northern Britain. Rome would forget them. Britain never would. To him, it was an administrative detail. Move dangerous men far from home so they can never raise a rebellion. He signed it. He moved on. He had no idea what he had just set in motion. He had just lit the fuse on the most enduring legend the island of Britain would ever produce. Years later, a Roman officer rode north to take command of those horsemen, or rather, of their sons and grandsons, rooted now for a generation at a fort called Remetenicum. Today, it's a quiet Lancashire village called Ribchester. The officer's name was Lucius Artorius Castus, a centurion who had climbed through legion after legion, from one end of the empire to the other. He had commanded Roman troops his entire life. He had never commanded anything like this. Picture what he rode into. Thousands of horsemen descended from the Eurasian steppe, men whose grandfathers had been dragged a quarter of the way around the world and told this freezing island was now home. They did not fight like Romans. They did not look like Romans. Glittering scale from head to foot, and, strangest of all to a Roman eye, trousers. Armored horses and lances long enough to spear a man clean off his mount. And they carried a dragon. It sat at the top of a standard, a hollow bronze head with gaping jaws trailing a long tube of fabric behind it. On the ground, it hung limp and dead. But when the riders kicked into a gallop, the wind rushed through it. The body filled, writhed, and the dragon came alive. They had carried it across the world to terrify their enemies. It worked on everyone who saw it, including, quietly, the men who carried it. And there was one thing more. These men worshipped a sword. Not a god you could picture, not a temple, a single iron blade, driven point down into the earth, that they believed had fallen out of the sky. Whoever was worthy could draw it. Whoever drew it would win. Artorius used their skill. He drilled them and led them. He did not share their gods. In his report, he noted the unit's strength and readiness. He said nothing about the dragon. He didn't know what a Roman was supposed to say about a dragon. For a while, the frontier held. And then, in the year 180, the man who had sent these horsemen to Britain died. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher, the emperor who had filled a private journal with the conviction that nothing lasts, was gone. Historians would come to call him the last of the good emperors, the final ruler of Rome's long golden afternoon. After him, the light began to go out. Because what came next was his son, Commodus, a young man with no interest in the grinding work of holding an empire together, and an enormous interest in himself. He spent his days in the arena, dressed as the demigod Hercules, fighting staged battles against opponents who knew better than to win. The steadiness at the top vanished almost overnight. And on a frontier 3,000 miles away, the men holding the line felt it first. Because to the north of them ran a wall, the hard stone edge of the Roman world. And beyond it lived tribes who had spent decades watching and waiting. They felt the empire flinch, and they did not wait long. Here is the part most histories hurry past. Around the time Aurelius died, those northern tribes came over the wall in force. They cut down a Roman general in the open field and destroyed the army he commanded. The historian Cassius Dio, a sober man not given to drama, called it the most serious war of Commodus's entire reign. The most serious war of the reign, not on some distant border nobody had heard of. Here, in Britain, exactly where Artorius and his dragon riders were stationed. We don't know exactly which of these battles Artorius fought, or where. The record of his life is thin, a handful of lines on a stone 1,500 miles from Britain. But we know the war that swallowed his world, and we know what his men turned into when they finally rode. So picture a gray morning in the north, mist on the heather, breath steaming in the cold. On one side, the tribes, fast, screaming, lightly armed, fighting for the ground their fathers were buried in. On the other, something the island had almost never seen, a long line of heavy cavalry, men sheathed in scale from helmet to boot, lances leveled on armored horses, warriors whose bloodline ran all the way back to the steppe. And above them, lifted on poles, the dragons. When that line surged forward, the wind tore through the hollow standards, and the dragons came alive. They swelled, they writhed and snapped overhead. From the tribal side of the field, it would not have looked like men at all. It would have looked like something breathing was coming for you, something ancient and vast and wrong, pouring out of the fog with a sound like the sky tearing open. This was what Rome had actually bought on the Danube. Not just 5,000 soldiers, a weapon, a piece of pure terror carried to the very end of the map and pointed north. And in the middle of it rode a Roman, Artorius, leading horsemen who answered to a dragon and a sky-fallen sword, neither of which belonged to him. He carried that standard at the head of the charge. He did not own it. It belonged to something far older than the empire that had sent him here. And on a freezing morning at the edge of the world, every man on that field could feel it. The tribal line broke. The frontier, for now, held. And in Rome, far from the mud and the blood and the dragons, someone was already preparing to make sure Artorius would not be the one remembered for it. By around the year 184, the war in the north was won. A hard governor finished the job. The frontier was stabilized, and the news made the long journey back to Rome, where it was quietly turned into something else. Commodus, who had never set foot in Britain, who was at that moment busy in the arena pretending to be a god, took the victory for himself. He awarded himself a new title, Britannicus, Conqueror of Britain. He struck coins to announce it across the empire. A war fought and bled out in the freezing mud at the edge of the world by horsemen from the steppe, and officers like Artorius became a shiny disc of metal with another man's face stamped on it. Those coins traveled. Some reached Britain. Army pay passed hand to hand along the very wall the war had been fought over. Somewhere at the edge of the world, Artorius may have held one and read another man's name on his own victory. This is the oldest story there is. The people who do the work, and the man who takes the name. And the soldiers knew exactly what had happened. A few years later, the army in Britain was so disgusted with how Rome was treating it that 1,500 men did something almost unthinkable. They walked off the frontier, marched the entire length of the empire to Italy, and confronted the emperor to his face. They demanded the head of one of his most powerful ministers, and they got it. Then they turned around and marched back to the wall. That is how angry the men holding the edge of the Roman world had become. But there is one detail on that broken stone in Croatia that changes everything. Among the titles Artorius carved into the record of his life is a single Roman military rank. Dux. Leader. The commander of a force pulled from the legions for a special campaign. Hold on to that word. Dux. Because more than 800 years later, when a Welsh monk sat down to write the first surviving account of a half-remembered British war leader named Arthur, the title he reached for was almost exactly the same. Not king, not emperor. Dux Bellorum, the leader of battles. It is the only such title ever given to Arthur in the earliest sources, and it is not a Celtic word. It is a Roman one. Artorius did not die on that frontier. That is the first surprise. After Britain, the stone tells us, he was given one last command, and then he went home. All the way back across the empire to the warm Adriatic coast of Dalmatia in what is now Croatia, a quiet and powerful civilian post, procurator of a province, a man with the authority to govern and to judge. He grew old, far from the wall, far from the cold, far from the dragons. There was no last stand, no grieving knights, no barge gliding across a misted lake to carry him away to be healed. The most famous death in all of British legend, the fall of King Arthur at Camlann, never happened to the man who may have inspired him. He simply got old. He retired, and he died in his bed in the sun. By every reasonable measure, that should have been the end of it. The kind of life the empire produced 10,000 times over and remembered not a single one of. It was not the end of it. Because of one thing he did before he died, and one thing he left behind that he never understood the value of. The thing he did was this. Before he died, Lucius Artorius Castus paid to have his entire life carved into stone. Every rank, every command, every posting, set down in order and in full. He wrote his own record with his own money while he still could, because he had watched another man take the name Britannicus for a war he never fought, and he had learned the lesson of his whole career. Rome does not remember the people at the edge. If you want to last, you carve it yourself. He was almost right. That stone is the single reason we can connect him to anything at all, and still, for 1,800 years, almost no one has read it. But the thing he left behind needed no stone. The dragon survived. When Rome finally let go of Britain and the legions sailed away, the soldiers who stayed became the island's first warlords, and the dragon they had carried became a banner, then a symbol, then a legend. A red dragon on a field of green. A sword no ordinary man could draw. A Dux Bellorum, a leader of battles, holding the line in a dark age when no help was ever coming. 400 years after Artorius, a poet could praise a great warrior with a single line. He was no Arthur, and every listener already understood. The name had become the measure of greatness itself. He got the immortality he had been so terrified of losing, just not as himself. And the man who started all of it, the emperor at the camp desk who had written that every name dissolves, that even Caesar was already an echo, turned out to be wrong about the one thing he was most certain of. Arthur outlasted his empire. Arthur outlasted his meditations. Arthur outlasted Rome itself. The most enduring legend in the history of Britain began as a 10-minute decision, made and then forgotten by the one man who spent his entire life insisting that nothing endures. Here is what Artorius leaves us with. We almost never remember people as they actually were. We remember the version we needed them to be. Simpler, larger, cleaner, easier to tell. And in the telling, we quietly erase the real, complicated person underneath. You have seen it happen. The founder who becomes the genius of the story, while the people who actually built the thing get a line in the credits. The grandfather turned into a flawless war hero until the frightened, contradictory man he really was disappears inside the legend. The friend who held everyone together for years, remembered for one grand gesture instead of the 1,000 quiet ones that mattered more. So here is the question to sit with tonight. Who in your life have you turned into a legend? And what did you have to leave out to make the story work? Because every legend is built on the ruins of someone's real life. And the tragedy is not that we forget the person. It's that we replace them with something they would never have recognized as themselves. This has been Lessons from History. If this one stayed with you, share it with someone who is still doing the work that nobody has put a name to yet. There are people in your life who deserve to be remembered as they really were, not flattened into the version that is easier to tell. And if you want to keep uncovering the real people that history rewrote into legend, subscribe. There are more names waiting under the stone.